All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to move on here to our last part of period two, which will be the French Revolution. We're going to start this up in class, and we're going to finish it, through our videos and notes and those kind of things as well here. Once my screen wants to load. French Revolution is a big time. We're going to be really focusing on about 10 years or so here, where the French Revolution happens, and it happens in what we call three phases. The first phase kind of being Republic phase, second phase being what we call the Terror, and the last phase then being our homeboy Napoleon. And so we're going to start off here with the French Revolution, talk about what we feel like historians think is the direct cause of the French Revolution. And a lot of times, French Revolution's direct causes are seen in economic problems. The economy of France the bottom finally falls out on it, essentially, is what goes down. We've talked about economics of France for a long time, going back to Louis XIV, 100 years prior. That's where he spent a lot of money on things like, Versailles, wars, all those kind of things. Well, Louis XVI, and we'll talk this in class, is the new king. Okay, he becomes king in the 1770s after the passing of Louis XV. And he spent money pretty liberally. One of the things he did was he helped out the little fledgling U.S. in the Revolutionary War. So essentially, there's a lot of money being spent here. Well, he has, much like his great-great-grandfather did, Louis XIV, an economic advisor. This economic advisor was very, very popular, named Jacques Necker. Jacques Necker was very, very liberal and didn't necessarily agree with all of the ideas the king had to try and fix the economy. But he was very, very, very popular among the people. Well, there's an assembly of notables in 1787, a group of people that the king went to, a bunch of nobles and upstanding people. And remember, the nobles have kind of left Versailles at this point. Louis XV, Louis XVI don't have the same power, if you will, Louis XIV didn't have, keep his nobles in check. But the king comes, he asks for backing on new taxes, economic programs. He wants to try and use new taxes to pay off bills and those kind of things, whereas the nobles wanted all their spending to go to their local leaders and local nobility. That way they want to be able to spend money on themselves in their own home areas. Well, essentially the king decides to just dismiss the nobles and make all of his own new taxes in that way. And so the parliaments, who he had brought back, which are these kind of like a Supreme Court type situation that could block illegal laws, those kind of things, the parliaments blocked the taxes and essentially forced the king to rule with the nobles, and which are the second estate. And so the king is forced for only the third time in like 400 years to call the Estates General. And we'll see the picture here. The Estates General said, it's the third election ever. So we had one in 1302, one in 1614, and all the areas of France would bring their ideas to the king. Tradition was that each estate had one vote. So the first estate, being the clergy, had one vote total as a whole group. The second estate had one vote, being all nobility. Lastly, the third estate, being everybody else, had one vote. The problem was that population-wise, the third estate had a lot more people than the first two states combined, which means the first, second state kind of ruled everything, even though they were a minority, and it caused a lot of dysfunction between the estates. And so we see an image of the Estates General and how they were trying to show off, when they met together. So now we call the first part of the French Revolution either the first stage or the age of Montesquieu, because we have this meeting of the Estates General at that place there, and the third estate is kind of a little protest thing. They feel it's wrong that the first, second estates have all this power, and what this third estate does, they meet together and they essentially refuse to meet with everybody else. They essentially lock out because they can't discuss anything, can't vote unless the third estate is actually there. So for 6 weeks after they call the Estates General, nothing actually happens. And then come July 17, the third estate meets, and the middle class, especially the bourgeois of that third estate, essentially say that they have become the National Assembly of France. There's no, estates that, advise the king. Instead, it's going to be the case of they are the national assembly who makes the laws. Well, Louis is like, yeah, we can't do this, all right? And so he essentially locks out that third estate and says, "You cannot meet. I will not hear you say this." So they meet at the third estate meets at an indoor tennis court, and they sign what's called the tennis court oath, something we're looking at in class this week. That essentially says that the third estate, they say that they will stay together. They will stick together until a constitution is created to create a national assembly and a Republic of France. Even some members of the first, second estates will defect away from their groups and sign the oath and join on with the third estate. And eventually, Louis has to cave because absolutely nothing's getting done right now. And he has to recognize that there is now a National Assembly of France, and he kind of has to, deal with it. And that's something will be run by the bourgeois. So you kind of start seeing this class division start here, right? You have nobility allied with Louis, and you have the third estate, who is essentially being run by that growing middle class we had in France. Now, this all happened out in Versailles, right? The situation in Paris is not very good either, okay? Paris is bad, okay? The food prices of Paris are going through the roof, okay? To buy those 2 loaves of bread that people need every single day, it's darn near impossible trying to survive as a family. You have 1/4 of Paris that is currently out of work. So obviously people aren't making money, aren't feeding their families. And as people are, trying to figure out what to do here, there's a big fear of the military presence, French military presence in Paris. And that if Louis will use that military on them. Top it off, when Jacques Necker was fired, he was very, very popular with people. And they thought that it was going to be more of a hands-on approach now to the economy and to the military. Now, the people started getting ready for essentially a throwdown with the government. The people arm themselves whether they can get be pikes, sticks, pitchforks, clubs, old guns, whatever they have. Basically, they need is gunpowder, and because gunpowder wasn't readily available and it was very, very expensive. So the main place to get is a place called the Bastille. The Bastille was a giant 8-towered 14th century fortress in Paris that Louis XIV used as a prison. I mean, there have been over 5,000 people that were held there who were enemies of Louis. And so what the peasants do is they storm the Bastille. Now, the Bastille isn't very well defended right now. Not a huge number of soldiers there. And so the people, they storm the Bastille very, very quickly. And when they storm this Bastille, they capture the fort's governor, they capture the mayor, they basically run down the doors, and they kill everyone who's in charge, and they put their heads on pikes and proceed to parade them throughout the streets of Paris. You're going to see this will become a tradition through the French Revolution. The idea of parading around with heads on pikes is a big deal. Since the new mayor and military governor are dead, the people of Paris named a very, very popular military general, the Marquis de Lafayette, who had fought in the American Revolutionary War with General Washington, as the new head of Paris, and kind of takes over as the head of this mob. And then you have Louis. Louis is stuck out there in Versailles, and he's like, "Crap! I lost Paris. I'm 17 miles away. I'm kind of in a rough situation right now." He's stuck out in Versailles with Marie Antoinette, with his hobbies like locksmithing, and he essentially is forced now to keep that National Assembly around. So Paris is lost. Paris is in flames right now. And the revolutionary spirit spreads to the countryside, something called the Great Fear. Peasants everywhere start attacking the noble homes of the manor homes of the nobles, fearing kind of this big class war. And so you kind of see this idea of rich versus poor, noble versus not noble take place. And one big things they target are these things called the records of feudal obligation, the documents that said you have to work for this noble on this piece of land. And so they took those records and burned them because then, hey, look, there's no evidence that I have to work on your land anymore, and feudalism's done. It's kind of their way to protest against the way things have been in France for so long. And a lot of things, they did to what they felt was to make things more equal across the board. They tore down the fences that separated all the noble lands and the lands that had been fenced off for personal use. The common lands that used to exist in cities, they took back and made them common. They said they wouldn't pay taxes. They locked nobles out of they captured and locked nobles out of the forest for hunting and fishing rights and those kind of things. Essentially, they target everybody who's not them. And this is all the peasantry doing this. The middle class actually makes its own national guard, kind of get themselves together with guns and whoever they can to protect their property. The nobles, who are richer, can hire mercs to come in and protect their properties. It is definitely a situation where there's this great fear that kind of comes across most of France among what's going to happen next, and the whole country of France will explode like Paris did. Now, one of the first things that the National Assembly does when it votes is to abolish feudalism, and they said that we're going to make a flat tax for everybody. Now, early on, typically those who were peasants on feudal lands got taxed more to help pay the nobles their taxes. So is one of two big changes. They also ended guilds, so anyone could enter a field. And so they basically voted to abolish the idea of feudalism altogether and said everyone will be taxed equally the same thing. And so they also voted to end the violence and stop those as well. So all these different taxes that have been there, fees to use equipment like wine presses and cheesemaker, that kind of stuff, the corvée, which was their general tax, tithes, exclusive hunting rights for nobles only in forests, justice fees for trials, all those kind of things were gone. And it was a huge, big victory for the peasantry, for the Third Estate. And they're going to say, hey, look, we can advance ourselves. We can make our lives better here in France. Now, another thing that's issued by the National Assembly is something called the Declaration of Rights of Man and eventually a new constitution. It was going to be a blueprint for their government listing natural rights. And it was proposed by the Marquis de Lafayette, Jean Lafayette. And Thomas Jefferson actually had a big hand in helping write this document. At the time, he was in Paris as the U.S. envoy to France. Just kind of taking a break from this for a second here, we'll look at a couple of documents in class about this. But women honestly did not share the same rights as men in the Revolution. Even though all these things are being posted, okay, men still have big advantages in a lot of things, like family. Men were still technically head of the family, and they had all control over family. You have property, where men held property rights in marriage, and those kind of things. Job-wise, men still offer all the jobs. Public office was still only open to males. So it's definitely a very patriarchal society, and almost all the men in the National Assembly really share these ideas. And women, for the most part, were not really allowed to participate in the formal part of this. Even to the Enlightenment, where women ran the salons, those kind of things, it wasn't like they were formally, writing everything or getting a chance to do that. I will look at two documents from Mary Wollstonecraft and Olympe de Gouges, who have a response, if you will, to this document, that kind of thing. And one of the big things in this Declaration of Rights of Man, we'll look at the whole document later on as well, will be freedom of speech. So one of the big things that newspapers now have freedom of press. Remember earlier in the Enlightenment, people had to write under pseudonyms. They had to write in satirical methods to voice their opinions. Now, it's open season, ladies and gentlemen, and they can throw any ideas they want to throw out there. One of the most famous of these journalists was a man named Jean-Paul Marat, who called himself the friend of the people. And he was a guy who he was a former scientist, Enlightenment type guy, who was basically a malcontent. He wrote a lot of things to stir up revolutionary problems. He wrote about things the king might do, nobles might do, things that they're doing. Some of these were true, some of these were not very true. And he wrote this big newspaper, right, from the people, from his bathtub. He had a skin condition, right? He had some kind of skin condition where he had to be soaking in the tub all the time, or else it's going to be really dry and crack and bleed and all that kind of nasty stuff. And this guy was absolutely hated by the nobles, hated by the royalty, and he really wanted to see a more radical response to the revolution. And we're going to pass up here, and as he's writing here, eventually we start seeing the women actually take charge in the revolution. We'll watch a little video on this in class as well, but the women of Paris end up making a march to France. The price of bread jacks up again in Paris, and now families cannot feed themselves. So these group of women from Paris who can't feed their kids because bread's too expensive will end up marching to Versailles, carrying all the weapons they can, pitchforks and clubs and that kind of stuff, right? And essentially hold the king at pitchfork point to sign a law putting a cap on the price of bread. And to top it off, then the king and queen are taken to Paris because, you know what? In Versailles, they were protected. They could do what they wanted to do and not see what the people's plights were. Because here's a cool little painting. You kind of see women who are bringing pikes, halberds, clubs, cannons, etc., to Paris. And so now they're going to force the king and queen, Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, to live in the Tuileries, which is the Paris Palace. And they also bring the National Assembly there as well. So the capital shifts from from Versailles to Paris. And Paris is very, very different. I mean, Paris is different from the rest of France. The rest of France is, very, very, very rural, small town feel to it. Paris is a hotbed. Paris is, one of the biggest cities in Europe. Paris has seen a lot of change over time, and Paris is by far the most revolutionary place that there is. As a member of National Assembly, I'd be kind of nervous in Paris because, they have this big threat of violence. You just saw the Bastille happen the year before, where, they paraded heads to the street on pikes. This is kind of a big deal here, and they're kind of almost using terror as a way to control the government. One of the things that the National Assembly does pass too is something called the Constitution of Clergy, where they take the French Church, which had been the Gallican Church, the Catholic Church, and they nationalize it. They create instead a national church based more on reason, those kind of things, with 83 districts on it. Basically, anyone can be any religion they want to be. There's no formal or official religion, no hierarchy, no first estate. And that everyone's first loyalty should be France, and that church and that clergy and church people were essentially forced now to sign a loyalty oath to France. This is the first big failure, and here's why. Even though France was a very enlightened nation, Enlightenment was kind of it headed up in France. At the same time, France is still very much a Catholic country, and you start messing with people's religion, people start getting a little ticked off. And by messing with religion this way, the peasants kind of start looking like, hey, you don't mess with my religion, something you don't mess with, and they start questioning kind of why the assembly is doing what they're doing. And so now the peasants are kind of start going against the assembly and questioning if we're doing things right with the church. Now, not everyone agree with this. There's something called the refractory clergy, where about half the priests would refuse to sign this whole constitution. Even the Pope himself said, they condemn this idea. And so now the people are split. Some are following the National Assembly and the clergy that agree to this. The other part are kind of like, well, I'm going to follow a refractory clergy. The refractory clergy support more of the king and former aristocrats. Even a lot of the urban workers and peasants were still very, very religious. And so you would start splitting your people here, your revolutionary force, those who are religious, those who aren't religious. Essentially, we would call this part of France would be a constitutional monarchy, if you will. The king was still there. The king was still technically in charge, but there was a constitution and a parliament, if you will, that was kind of set to assembly. And by voting wise, the peasants were still locked out of this thing. There were a lot of property right issues and property requirements for both being able to run for office and be able to vote. And so, the peasants were still locked out of most of the government issues. And they had these 83 districts around France, and so they elect people in some of the National Assembly. Well, local elected people essentially enforced their own laws because this head government was so weak. It was centralized in Paris. There were worried about stuff there. And they really couldn't do much. It was out there on their own. So really, France kind of becomes a Wild West kind of situation that, the local cities and stuff essentially just, enforce the laws their own way more than anything. And you have the money issue. France is still poor. France is still broke. And so one of the things that they do is they start selling off church land to pay off the debt, kind of a Henry VIII type deal, which, is one start. But then the problem is you anger the church, anger the people that, had been based around these parish churches. I mean, especially small towns, it was based around that local parish. And so that starts taking people off as well. The other thing they start doing is making paper money to pay bills off. Call it the assignat. Well, the paper money is fine, but at the same time, there's nothing to back paper money up. You can print as much paper money as you want to, but at the time, it still needs to be backed up by gold or silver, which they don't have. And so that causes more problems as well because you're going to jack up inflation if people try to use this in paper money. You have the Le Chapelier law, which is basically you can't strike anymore, and that guilds and unions can't do a thing. So we're starting to see a lot of people questioning of why this government's doing almost more oppression this way coming from this new National Assembly. The other thing, they switched the metric system. Kind of cool. Start using that kind of idea. And we're getting to the end of our video here, but come June 1791, Louis ends up fleeing. One of the things he has done, he has not signed this constitution yet, And one of the things he does in the middle of the night, he tries to escape to Austria, the homeland of his wife, Marie Antoinette. He does this to try not to sign the Constitution. He may get an army up with Austria and take back his country. The people actually track him down, find him, and drag him back to Paris, where he is captured by his mob and dragged back and is a prisoner in his own castle and being forced to sign this Constitution. And so originally, Louis was, pretty okay with stuff. He was pretty, I'll go along with it to a degree. But now, he is definitely seen as a prisoner. And for the people, he is seen as a traitor because he was the guy who was trying to get away, go to another country, try to leave. And that's a big problem. And we're going to see, as the results of the terror happen next, why that ends up being Louis' demise. We're going to leave that, guys, with class for Monday. Thank you very much for your attention. I really, really appreciate it. We'll see you guys in class. So I may read a couple documents over the weekend as well, along with this video, so we can discuss them on Monday. Thanks.